The red envelope was taped to my front door so hard it tore the paint when I pulled it off. Across the front, in thick black letters, it said HOA violation notice, and underneath that was the number that made my stomach drop: $1,850, pending immediate enforcement. I had not even finished reading the first paragraph when I heard a woman clear her throat behind me. Vanessa Hartley was standing at the edge of my driveway with her phone in one hand and a smile that looked practiced. She lived next door, sat on the Brookhaven Pines HOA board, and treated every lawn in the neighborhood like it belonged to her personally. The notice claimed my front garden was neglected, hazardous, and damaging property values. It gave me 72 hours to remove the native flowers, cut down the milkweed, clear the shrubs, and restore the yard to approved turf condition. If I refused, the HOA would hire a landscaping crew, bill me for the work, and add the charges to my property account. If I still refused to pay, they threatened to place a lien on my home. That garden was not weeds. It was not trash. It was not some abandoned patch of dirt. It was the pollinator garden I had planted for my late wife Laura after she passed away. Every flower had a reason. Every row had been approved. Every inch sat inside my property line. But Vanessa did not look at it like a garden. She looked at it like a problem she had finally found a way to erase. She told me the board had seen enough, that the neighborhood had standards, and that sentimental excuses did not override HOA rules. She said the landscapers could be there by Friday morning, and that I should make it easy on myself by signing the access form before the fines doubled. I remember standing there barefoot on my porch, holding that notice, feeling my hands shake. Not from fear exactly, but from the kind of anger that makes the whole world go quiet. Vanessa turned her phone toward my yard and took another picture, as if she wanted one last trophy before the garden disappeared. What she did not know was that 2 weeks later, that same smug smile would vanish in a packed HOA clubhouse. Her own board would sit frozen while my attorney played security footage on a projector screen. The whole neighborhood would watch Vanessa step onto my property in the middle of the night, damage my plants, dump yard debris into my flower beds, and then photograph the mess as evidence against me. And by the end of that meeting, the woman who tried to use the HOA to destroy my garden would lose her seat on the board. But on that morning, I did not argue with her. I did not yell. I did not threaten anyone. I just looked past Vanessa, up at the small black camera tucked under my porch roof, and realized it had been watching my garden all night. 3 years before Vanessa Hartley ever taped that red notice to my door, Brookhaven Pines had felt like the first quiet place I had been able to breathe in a long time. I bought the house 6 months after my wife Laura passed away, not because it was perfect, but because it had a wide front yard that caught the morning sun. The realtor kept talking about square footage, resale value, and school districts, but all I could see was Laura standing there in my memory, pointing at the empty lawn and imagining flowers where everyone else saw grass. Laura had loved native plants. She could name butterflies the way other people named celebrities, and she used to say that a yard did not have to look like a golf course to be beautiful. She believed a home should give something back to the world around it, even if it was just a place for bees, birds, and monarchs to rest. After she was gone, I did not know what to do with the silence in that house, so I started with the soil. I was not trying to make a statement. I was not trying to irritate the HOA or challenge anyone's idea of a perfect neighborhood. I just wanted one corner of my life to feel alive again. I spent weekends pulling out dead turf, laying mulch, planting milkweed, lavender, coneflowers, black-eyed Susans, and low native shrubs that stayed well inside the setback. I measured everything twice because I knew Brookhaven Pines had rules, and I had no interest in becoming that homeowner everyone whispered about at board meetings. Before I planted the first full bed, I sent the HOA Architectural Committee a complete request. I included a simple drawing of the layout, plant names, estimated heights, border distance from the sidewalk, and pictures of what the garden would look like when mature. The old community manager approved it by email 2 weeks later. I printed the approval, saved the PDF, and filed it away with my deed, insurance papers, and closing documents. At the time, it felt almost unnecessary. I had followed the process. I had permission. I thought that was the end of it. For a while it was. The garden became the part of the house that made me want to get up early. On quiet mornings, I would stand on the porch with coffee while the sun came over the rooftops and lit up the flowers one row at a time. Some neighbors slowed down during their walks to look at the butterflies. A retired teacher from the next block once left a handwritten note in my mailbox saying the garden reminded her of the fields behind her childhood home. Even a few kids on bikes would stop near the sidewalk and point whenever they saw a monarch land on the milkweed. Those small moments mattered more than I could explain. The garden was not just landscaping. It was the last conversation I still felt like I was having with my wife. Every bloom felt like proof that grief could turn into something softer if you gave it enough time and enough care. So when people online talk about HOAs going too far, or neighbors treating private property like a community project they get to control, I understand that anger in a way I wish I did not. If you have ever had someone look at something meaningful on your own land and decide they had the right to erase it, then you already know why this kind of story hits differently. Vanessa moved into the house next door about a year after I finished the main garden beds. From the beginning, she carried herself like Brookhaven Pines was not just where she lived, but something she had been hired to manage. Her lawn was trimmed into perfect lines. Her shrubs were squared off like walls. Her porch decorations changed with every season, each one matching the approved color palette from the HOA newsletter. None of that bothered me. People should be allowed to love their property in their own way. The problem was that Vanessa did not believe other people deserved the same freedom. At first, her comments were polished enough to sound like concern. She would pause near my driveway during her evening walks and mention that the flowers were getting tall, or that some buyers preferred a cleaner look, or that native gardens could be misunderstood if they were not maintained properly. I usually nodded, stayed polite, and went back to trimming the edges, because I had already learned that not every opinion deserved a fight. Then she got elected to the HOA board. After that, her tone changed. She started using phrases from the bylaws in casual conversation. She talked about community standards, visual harmony, neighborhood image, and enforcement consistency, as if those words gave her ownership over everyone's front yard. She began walking slower past my house, taking pictures from the sidewalk, and glancing at my garden like she was building a case only she knew about. I still did not panic. I had the approval email. I had kept the beds neat. I had stayed inside my property line. I believed the rules would protect me because I had followed them. What I did not understand yet was that Vanessa was not interested in the rules. She was interested in control. And by the time I realized that, she had already started turning my garden into evidence against me. The first official warning came on a Tuesday afternoon, folded into a plain white envelope and tucked halfway under my doormat. It was not the red notice yet. That came later. This one was softer, cleaner, and almost polite, which somehow made it feel more calculated. The letter said my front yard had received multiple complaints for excessive vegetation, inconsistent curb appeal, and potential nuisance conditions. It instructed me to cut all plant growth below 6 inches within 10 days, or submit a corrective landscaping plan for board review. I read it twice, standing in the doorway with the afternoon heat pressing against my back, trying to understand how a garden that had already been approved had suddenly become a violation. The beds were edged, the mulch was fresh, the walkway was clear, nothing blocked the sidewalk, the driveway, or anyone's view of traffic. The tallest flowers were exactly where I had placed them on the original plan, far away from the street and nowhere near the property line. So I did what I thought a reasonable person was supposed to do. I replied to the HOA manager with the original approval email attached. I included updated photos of the garden, a copy of the plant list, and a calm explanation that the flowers were seasonal native species, not neglected weeds. I also reminded them that the garden had been approved by the architectural committee before installation. For 3 days, nothing happened. Then Vanessa started walking past my house every morning, not once in a while, every morning, sometimes twice. She would slow down at the corner of my driveway, lift her phone, and take pictures from angles that made the garden look as wild as possible. She never stepped onto my grass in daylight, but she leaned over the edge of the sidewalk like she was documenting a crime scene. If a flower leaned after rain, she photographed it. If a leaf dropped near the curb, she photographed it. If a bee moved between blossoms, she photographed that too. A week later, the second notice arrived. This one was sharper. The HOA claimed I had failed to correct the violation and that the board had received photographic evidence showing deterioration. A $350 fine had been assessed to my account, with additional penalties scheduled if the yard remained out of compliance. That was the first moment I felt something shift from annoying to personal. I emailed again, asking who had reviewed the evidence and why the prior approval had not been considered. The manager replied with language that sounded copied from a policy manual. The board had the authority to determine ongoing compliance. Prior approval did not excuse failure to maintain. The matter would remain open until corrected. The next morning, I found the first damage. 3 coneflowers near the front border had been snapped at the stems. Not bent by wind, not chewed by an animal. Snapped clean, like someone had grabbed them in a fist and twisted. A section of mulch had been scraped out of place, leaving bare dirt exposed in a rough patch near the sidewalk. At the far corner of the bed, where I kept low lavender, someone had dumped a small pile of damp grass clippings mixed with weeds and dead leaves. For a few seconds, I just stood there staring at it. My first instinct was to blame raccoons, or maybe a careless dog walker, because the alternative felt too ugly to accept. I cleaned it up, took pictures from my own records, and told myself not to assume the worst. By noon, an HOA email appeared in my inbox. Attached were pictures of the exact damage I had found that morning: the snapped flowers, the exposed dirt, the pile of yard debris before I removed it. The message said the board had received updated evidence confirming neglect and unsanitary conditions. My account had been assessed another $500, and if I did not bring the yard into compliance within 72 hours, the HOA would proceed with third-party remediation. That phrase made my chest tighten. Third-party remediation meant they were preparing to send a landscaping crew onto my property. They were not just asking me to trim flowers anymore. They were getting ready to erase the garden completely and charge me for it. Later that afternoon, Vanessa appeared near my driveway while I was replacing the damaged mulch. She stood on the sidewalk in workout clothes, one hand resting on her hip, watching me like a supervisor checking on slow labor. She did not offer help. She did not ask what had happened. She looked at the broken stems, then at me, with the calm satisfaction of someone watching a plan move exactly as expected. She reminded me that Brookhaven Pines had standards. She said the board could not make emotional exceptions for every homeowner with a personal story. She said native plants were fine in parks and nature trails, but not in a front yard that affected everyone's property values. Then she mentioned, almost casually, that the HOA had a landscaper ready if I refused to cooperate. I asked for the company name through the HOA manager that evening. The estimate arrived the next day. The company was Hartley Outdoor Services. At first, I thought the name had to be a coincidence. Then I searched the business registration. The owner was Marcus Hartley, Vanessa's cousin. His company had been hired for seasonal cleanup projects around the neighborhood before, but this estimate was different. It was not for trimming, it was not for maintenance. It described full removal of non-compliant vegetation, disposal of organic material, turf restoration, and follow-up treatment to prevent regrowth. Prevent regrowth. That meant they were planning to destroy everything down to the roots. I read the estimate sitting at my kitchen table while the house went quiet around me. Outside the window, the garden moved softly in the evening light, damaged but still alive. The milkweed was blooming. A monarch drifted over the front bed and landed near one of the broken stems. That was when anger finally settled into something colder. Vanessa had not simply complained. She had pushed the HOA toward fines, built a record with selective photographs, and pointed the board toward a contractor connected to her own family. And somehow, the damage that made my garden look neglected had appeared right before the most damaging photos were submitted. I still did not know exactly how she had done it. I did not have the proof yet, but I knew enough to stop treating this like a misunderstanding. That night, instead of writing another defensive email, I opened my laptop, logged into the security system, and started downloading every camera file from the past 2 weeks. I did not sleep much that night. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that made every small sound feel sharper than it should have. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. The clock above the hallway clicked once every second. Outside, the garden sat under the porch light, bruised in places, but still standing. I kept thinking about the broken coneflowers, the pile of grass clippings, and Vanessa's face when she watched me cleaning up damage she had not even pretended to be surprised by. By midnight, my kitchen table had turned into a command center. I opened a folder on my laptop and named it Brookhaven Garden Evidence. Inside it, I created subfolders for HOA notices, approval records, photos, security footage, property documents, and contractor information. I scanned the red notice, the earlier warning letters, the fine statements, the landscaping estimate, and every email the HOA had sent me. I downloaded the original approval from the architectural committee and backed it up in 3 places. Because something about this no longer felt like a neighborhood disagreement. It felt like a paper trail I might have to defend in front of people who would only believe what I could prove. Then I opened the camera system. I had installed the cameras after a package theft 2 winters earlier. There was one above the front porch, one in the doorbell, and one mounted under the side of the garage where it could see the edge of the garden and the narrow strip between my house and Vanessa's. I had never thought of them as anything more than basic security. That night, they became the only witnesses I trusted. I started with the morning I found the first damage and worked backward. For the first hour, all I saw were normal things. Delivery trucks, dog walkers, a kid on a scooter, wind moving the flowers, a rabbit cutting across the mulch at dawn. Then, at 2:13 in the morning, the motion detection bar jumped. The porch camera showed a figure entering from the right side of the frame. At first, the person was just a dark shape in a hooded sweatshirt, moving slowly along the sidewalk. Then the figure stopped in front of my garden, looked up and down the street, and stepped over the border stones onto my property. My skin went cold before I even saw the face. The person crouched near the coneflowers and reached into the plants with both hands. A few seconds later, the flower stems jerked sideways and snapped. Then the person pulled something from a dark bag and scattered it across the mulch. Grass clippings, dead leaves, weeds. The exact mess I had cleaned up that morning. When the figure turned toward the driveway light, the camera caught enough of her face to remove any doubt. It was Vanessa. I did not move for a long time. I just sat there at the kitchen table with one hand on the mouse, staring at the paused frame. Part of me wanted to run next door and pound on her door until every light in the neighborhood came on. Another part wanted to upload the clip and let everyone see who she really was. But I knew that was exactly the kind of emotional reaction that could turn a clean case into a messy fight. So I breathed, saved the file, copied it to a drive, and kept watching. It was not a single incident. 4 nights earlier, Vanessa had crossed onto my property carrying a dead potted plant from her side yard and placed it behind my lavender bed where it would show up clearly from the sidewalk. 2 nights before that, she had pulled the small certified native pollinator habitat sign loose and tilted it forward so it looked neglected. Another clip showed her standing at the edge of the driveway before sunrise, taking pictures of the mess she had created only minutes earlier. The worst part was how calm she looked. She was not acting in anger. She was arranging a scene. By 3 a.m, I had a timeline. Vanessa damaged the garden. Vanessa photographed the damage. The HOA sent notices using those photos. Then Vanessa pushed for a cleanup contractor connected to her own family. I printed screenshots with timestamps, saved the original video files, and wrote down every date in a notebook so I would not rely on memory later. The next day, I stopped communicating with Vanessa entirely. I did not wave. I did not answer when she made comments from the sidewalk. I did not post anything online. Instead, I called a property rights attorney in town and sent him the documents. I included the original HOA approval, the notices, the fine amounts, the Hartley Outdoor Services estimate, the business registration showing Marcus Hartley as owner, and the video clips. His office called me back that afternoon. The attorney explained that the HOA had several problems. The garden had been approved in writing, which meant they could not simply pretend the approval never existed because a newer board member disliked it. Any enforcement action had to follow the governing documents, and the board needed a legitimate maintenance issue, not staged photographs created by someone trespassing onto my land. He also pointed out that if Vanessa had influenced the board to hire her cousin's company without disclosing the relationship, the issue was no longer just selective enforcement. It was a potential conflict of interest. That phrase changed everything. Conflict of interest meant Vanessa had not only tried to control my property, she may have tried to use the HOA's authority to create paid work for someone in her family. And if the board had relied on her complaint, her photos, and her recommendation, then every fine against me was sitting on contaminated evidence. The attorney told me to gather more before we made a formal move, so I requested the HOA meeting minutes, violation records, and any board communications related to my property. I asked for the name of every person who had reviewed the complaint and whether Vanessa had participated in the vote. I also contacted the county extension office that had certified the garden as a native pollinator habitat and asked for written confirmation that the plants listed in my HOA approval were legitimate native landscaping, not nuisance growth. By the end of the week, the documents started coming in. The meeting minutes were worse than I expected. Vanessa was listed as the reporting board member. She had submitted the photos, she had recommended escalation, and in the same meeting, she had suggested Hartley Outdoor Services as the preferred vendor for removal. There was no conflict disclosure attached, no note that the owner was her cousin, no record that she had recused herself. For the first time since the red notice appeared on my door, I felt the ground shift back under my feet. Vanessa had spent weeks making me feel like I was the one who had to explain myself. But now I had the approval, the rules, the county certification request, the contractor connection, and the footage of her crossing my property line in the dark. I was not ready to fight louder. I was ready to fight cleaner. The county letter arrived on a Friday morning, just as the HOA's 72-hour deadline was about to expire. I remember opening the email at my kitchen table with my coffee going cold beside me, expecting another polite confirmation that would help my case a little. Instead, what I read made me sit back in my chair and stare at the screen. The county extension office confirmed that my garden was a certified native pollinator habitat. The plants listed in my original HOA application were not invasive weeds, nuisance growth, or neglected vegetation. They were approved native species commonly recommended for residential pollinator support. The letter also stated that, based on the photos and planting list I provided, nothing about the garden appeared to violate county nuisance standards, sidewalk clearance rules, or visibility requirements. In plain English, the county had just confirmed what I had been saying from the beginning. My garden was not the violation. Vanessa's story was. I forwarded the letter to my attorney, and within an hour, he called me. His voice was calm, but there was a weight behind it that told me the situation had changed. He said the county letter mattered because it removed the HOA's easiest excuse. They could no longer claim they were simply responding to an obvious hazard or neglected yard. If they continued enforcement after receiving that confirmation, they would be choosing to ignore official evidence. Then he walked me through the HOA documents line by line. The first problem was the approval clause. Brookhaven Pines had a rule that said any landscaping modification approved by the architectural committee remained valid unless the homeowner materially changed the design or failed to maintain it in a way that created an actual nuisance. I had not changed the design, I had not expanded the beds, I had not planted anything outside the approved list. The only ugly photos the HOA had were photos of damage Vanessa had created herself. The second problem was the access clause. The HOA could not send a contractor onto private property just because a board member disliked someone's yard. They needed proper notice, a valid violation, and a good faith basis for emergency access. My garden was fully inside my property line. The survey I had pulled from my closing documents showed the beds did not touch common area, did not block an easement, and did not interfere with any shared maintenance zone. That meant if Hartley Outdoor Services stepped onto my yard and removed those plants, it would not be cleanup. It would be trespass and property damage. The third problem was Vanessa herself. My attorney had reviewed the meeting minutes, and the conflict was worse than I first understood. Vanessa was not just the neighbor who complained. She had submitted the evidence, argued for escalation, participated in the discussion, and recommended her cousin's company for the removal job. There was no disclosure in the minutes, no recusal, no note that Hartley Outdoor Services was connected to her family. She had presented the contractor as if it were a neutral vendor, while the board relied on her photos and her version of events. That was when my attorney used the phrase, breach of fiduciary duty. He explained that HOA board members had a duty to act in the interest of the association, not their own personal grudges or family connections. If Vanessa used her position to manufacture a violation, push fines, and direct paid work toward her cousin, then she had dragged the entire board into dangerous territory. But the real turning point came from the audio. One of my side cameras had picked up more than movement. It had recorded Vanessa whispering to herself while she crouched in my flower bed. At first, I almost missed it because the sound was faint under the night insects and distant traffic. My attorney's office cleaned up the audio enough to make it clear. Vanessa's voice said, "Let's see him explain this to the board." 7 words. 7 words that turned her from a concerned neighbor into someone staging evidence. After that, my attorney drafted a demand letter. It was not emotional. It did not insult Vanessa. It did not accuse the entire HOA of being corrupt. It simply laid out the facts in order. The original written approval, the county confirmation, the survey, the stage damage, the security footage, the audio, the conflict of interest, and the proposed contractor connection. The letter demanded that the HOA immediately cancel every fine against my account, withdraw the remediation threat, preserve all communications related to my property, prohibit any contractor from entering my land, and schedule a formal hearing where the full board would review the evidence. It also warned that if anyone entered my property without permission, or if the HOA attempted to charge me for destroying an approved garden based on falsified evidence, we would pursue claims for trespass, property damage, selective enforcement, and attorney's fees. For the first time, the silence came from their side. The HOA manager did not reply that afternoon. Vanessa did not walk past my house that evening. No new notice appeared on my door. The neighborhood felt strangely still, like everyone involved had suddenly realized this was no longer about flowers. Late that night, Vanessa finally sent one email. She wrote that camera footage did not prove intent, that board members had a duty to inspect neighborhood conditions, and that I was trying to distract from my failure to maintain my yard. She copied the HOA president, the property manager, and, by mistake, my attorney. My attorney replied with one sentence. The footage with audio will be presented at the hearing. After that, Vanessa stopped emailing. The first person to physically inspect the garden was not Vanessa, not the HOA, and not some landscaper with a truck and a weed trimmer. It was a county code enforcement officer in a white pickup, carrying a clipboard and wearing the calm expression of someone who had seen enough neighborhood disputes to know when a complaint smelled wrong. He walked the sidewalk, checked the driveway sightline, measured the distance between the front bed and the curb, and looked at the plants against the list from the county extension office. I stayed on the porch and let him do his job. Vanessa watched from her side window, half hidden behind the curtain. The inspection took less than 20 minutes. There was no sidewalk obstruction, no traffic visibility issue, no public nuisance, no overgrowth violation under county code. The officer noted that the garden was maintained, bordered, and located fully on private property. When the written report came through later that day, it said the same thing in plain language. The county found no violation. That report changed the temperature of the entire case. The HOA could still pretend I was being difficult, but they could no longer pretend a government inspector had backed them up. My attorney sent the county report, the extension office letter, the original HOA approval, the survey, and selected screenshots from the video to the HOA's attorney. He did not send everything at first. He saved the full footage for the hearing because he wanted the board to see Vanessa's actions in a setting where nobody could bury the evidence in an email chain. 2 days later, Brookhaven Pines announced a special meeting at the clubhouse. By then, the story had already spread through the neighborhood, but most people had only heard Vanessa's version. She had told people I was refusing to maintain my yard, that I was hiding behind grief to break community standards, and that the board had no choice but to act. Some residents arrived expecting to see an entitled homeowner get corrected. Others came because they were tired of Vanessa acting like every mailbox, flower bed, and porch chair required her approval. The clubhouse was packed when I walked in with my attorney. Vanessa sat at the board table in a cream blazer, hands folded, chin raised, looking like she was ready to perform confidence until everyone mistook it for innocence. The HOA president looked uncomfortable. The property manager would not meet my eyes. The association attorney had a stack of papers in front of him, and the tense posture of a man who already knew the board had a problem. Vanessa tried to frame the issue as simple enforcement. She spoke about standards, consistency, and protecting property values. She described my garden as an ongoing concern and herself as a board member who had only wanted fairness for the community. She never mentioned walking onto my property at night. She never mentioned her cousin's company. She never mentioned the camera. Then my attorney stood up. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse everyone in the room. He put a timeline on the projector screen. First, the original approval. Then the county certification, then the first complaint, then the fines, then the meeting minutes showing Vanessa as the reporting board member, then the estimate from Hartley Outdoor Services, then the business registration connecting that company to her cousin. People started shifting in their seats. After that, the lights dimmed and the first video played. The room went completely still. On the screen, Vanessa appeared at 2:13 in the morning, crossing from the sidewalk onto my property with a dark bag in her hand. Everyone watched her crouch near my coneflowers, snap the stems, scatter debris into the mulch, and take pictures of the damage she had created. The second clip showed her placing a dead potted plant behind my lavender. The third showed her tilting the habitat sign so it looked abandoned. Then the audio played, and her own voice made it clear she expected to use the mess against me at the board. No one needed me to explain what they had just seen. For the first time since this started, Vanessa had nothing polished to say. Her face lost color. She looked toward the HOA attorney, then toward the president, then down at the table as if the documents might give her somewhere to hide. A resident near the back asked why a board member was allowed to submit complaints, vote on enforcement, and recommend a family contractor in the same case. Another asked how many other homeowners had been fined based on Vanessa's photographs. The HOA president tried to restore order, but the room had already turned. This was no longer a garden dispute. It was a question of whether the board had allowed one neighbor to weaponize the HOA against another homeowner. The association attorney finally leaned toward the president and spoke quietly, but the room was so silent that several of us heard enough to understand the message. The enforcement had to stop. The fines had to be withdrawn. The board needed to address Vanessa's conduct immediately. Vanessa pushed her chair back as if she could simply leave before the meeting became official history. But before she reached the aisle, the HOA president called the room back to order, and one of the older board members raised his hand to make a motion. The motion was simple, but the room felt heavy when it was read out loud. Vanessa Hartley would be removed from any enforcement discussion involving my property immediately, and the board would begin a formal vote to remove her from her position for misconduct, undisclosed conflict of interest, and abuse of HOA authority. For the first time since I had known her, Vanessa did not look powerful. She looked small, not because anyone yelled at her, and not because anyone threatened her, but because every excuse she had built was sitting there, on the projector screen, with timestamps, documents, and her own voice attached to it. The board voted to cancel every fine on my account that night. The red notice, the $1,850 demand, the threat of third-party remediation, all of it was withdrawn in writing before I left the clubhouse. The HOA also agreed that no contractor, landscaper, board member, or management employee could step onto my property without written legal authority. My attorney made sure that sentence was included exactly as written. Hartley Outdoor Services lost the proposed cleanup job before a single truck ever reached my driveway. A week later, the HOA announced it would review all vendor relationships and require conflict disclosures from every board member. The president sent a formal apology to me, not a warm one, not a perfect one, but official enough to matter. They also reimbursed part of my attorney's fees because they knew the alternative would be explaining the whole thing in court. Vanessa resigned before the removal vote could be completed. She called it a personal decision in her letter to the neighborhood, but by then everyone had seen the footage. Nobody needed a translation. I did not sue her for everything I could have. Part of me wanted to. I will not pretend I was above that anger. But what I wanted most was already done. The fines were gone. The garden was safe. The HOA record showed the truth, and Vanessa no longer had the power to use a board seat like a weapon against people who simply wanted to live in peace on their own property. A few weeks later, the broken coneflowers started growing back. The lavender filled in again. Monarchs returned to the milkweed like nothing had ever happened. I put the certified native pollinator habitat sign back into the ground, straight this time, and above it, under the porch roof, I adjusted the camera so it covered every inch of the front bed. That garden still reminds me of Laura, but now it also reminds me of something else. You do not always win by shouting louder than the person trying to intimidate you. Sometimes you win by staying calm, saving every email, reading every rule, checking every property line, and letting the evidence speak when the lies finally run out of room. And if you have ever dealt with an HOA, a neighbor, or anyone who thought your property rights ended where their opinion began, let me know what you would have done. Would you have taken Vanessa to court, or would you have stopped once she lost her board seat? Like the story, if you believe homeowners should know their rights, share it with someone who needs the reminder, and subscribe for more stories where patience, proof, and the law hit harder than revenge ever could.